How do you feel? Like 25 plus years later, Bret Hart still like has this animosity, it feels like.
I really don't care anymore about Bret. I could care less.
He makes me sick, said the man who once seemed so sorry. And with those words, a wound that had sat quietly for decades was ripped wide open again, right in front of a watching wrestling world. Bill Goldberg had spent years saying sorry to Bret Hart for the kick that ended his career. He said sorry on television. He said sorry in private. He said sorry in interview after interview. Then one day he simply stopped. He said he was done. He said he had apologized 1,000,000 times and he was not going to keep tearing himself down for something that happened when he was young and green in the business. That single moment, so small in some ways, yet so heavy in others, tells you almost everything you need to know about Bill Goldberg's career. He became one of the biggest stars wrestling has ever produced. He also became a man that some of his own peers say they will never forgive. Goldberg was massive. He was fast. When his music hit, buildings shook and crowds rose to their feet as one, roaring with an energy that very few entrances in wrestling history have ever quite managed to match. He looked like a train that simply could not be stopped, and for years, that was exactly the point. But behind the smoke, the spear, and the roaring crowds, there was a very different story unfolding out of sight. Many of the men who actually stepped into the ring with him came out with a completely different opinion of Bill Goldberg. Some of them still hold that opinion today, years and even decades later. And while this story only gets darker from here, use the hype feature and give this video some hype. Because the more hype it gets, the deeper we can go into the moments wrestling tried so hard to bury. There are 10 names on this list. 10 wrestlers who clashed with Goldberg, who bled because of Goldberg, or who simply could not stand sharing a locker room with him for one reason or another. Some of them eventually made peace. Others never did, and probably never will. Stay with this one, because the final name on this list is the one wound that has still never properly closed. Goldberg did not rise through wrestling the way most of his peers did. Most wrestlers spend years working in small halls in front of tiny crowds, slowly learning their craft one bump at a time. They learn how to fall safely. They learn how to protect the man standing across the ring from them. They learn patience, timing, and trust. Goldberg skipped almost all of that. His path to wrestling started on a football field, where his body was torn apart during a short career in the National Football League, playing for 2 different American teams before injury cut that dream short. When that career ended suddenly, he was trained fast at a wrestling school and pushed to the very top faster than almost anyone before him. He won match after match in under 2 minutes, often finishing opponents before they had even settled into the contest. He rarely had to learn how to work a long match, how to sell pain properly, or how to control his own considerable strength against a smaller man. On television, this made him look completely unstoppable, a genuine monster who could not be touched. But it also meant that when a match slowed down, stretched out, or became less controlled, real problems appeared fast. Every single man on this list felt that problem in his own way, whether through a stiff shot that landed too hard, a storyline that spiraled out of control, or simply years of quiet backstage resentment that never really faded. There is another way to think about all of this. Wrestling has always relied on trust between 2 performers, a quiet, unspoken agreement that neither man will hurt the other unnecessarily, even while throwing real punches and real kicks at speed. That trust takes years to build properly, through hundreds of small matches in front of small crowds where nobody is watching closely and nobody gets hurt if a move goes slightly wrong. Goldberg never really got that slow education. He went from tearing his body apart on a football field to being one of the biggest stars on television in a remarkably short space of time. The wrestlers around him had to adapt to his instincts on the fly, in front of live television cameras, with very little room for error. Some of them paid a real physical price for that gap in experience. Others simply grew tired of covering for it. Either way, the list that follows tells the story of exactly how that gap played out, one relationship at a time. It is also worth saying plainly that Goldberg was not the only performer ever pushed quickly to the top of a wrestling company, but few of them carried a character built so completely around invincibility, and that specific combination of speed, power, and an unbeaten record made the gap between his television presentation and his real-world experience feel much wider than it might have for another star with a slower, steadier rise. Now, let us count them all down properly, starting from number 10. Number 10 on this list is Dolph Ziggler. In the summer of 2019, Goldberg badly needed a win, and not just inside the storyline itself. He had just walked away from a match against The Undertaker that had gone seriously wrong. He had knocked himself out against the ring post. He had missed key moves in front of a huge crowd. People backstage were genuinely worried that he could hurt himself, or worse, hurt his opponent in a future match if changes were not made. So the company built him a short, simple match designed purely to make him look strong again in front of a large crowd, and Dolph Ziggler was chosen to take the fall for that redemption story. Goldberg won in under 2 minutes flat. He speared Ziggler, lifted him for the jackhammer, and the crowd in Toronto cheered as if nothing had ever gone wrong at all. But the story did not end when the bell rang. A short time later, Goldberg filmed a tense, real backstage moment between himself and Ziggler and posted the footage online for millions of fans to see. Ziggler was furious about it. He went straight to social media and tore into Goldberg, accusing him of intentionally ruining his night off and telling him, quite bluntly, to take up fishing instead of wrestling if he wanted to avoid getting hurt. It played out as a small war fought almost entirely online, but underneath it, there was something bigger going on. Ziggler worked full weeks, took real physical bumps night after night, and carried plenty of less experienced opponents through difficult matches without complaint. Goldberg flew in for one night, hit 2 big signature moves, and flew home again with most of the spotlight. That gap between the two men never really closed. To this day, their relationship remains cold, and neither man has ever really bothered trying to fix it properly. It is worth remembering that Ziggler had spent years being the kind of performer who protects everyone he works with, taking hard falls night after night without complaint, so that the match still looked good on television. He had built his entire reputation on being reliable, safe, and consistent, the exact opposite of the reckless label that so often followed Goldberg around backstage. Watching a part-time star fly in, win in under 2 minutes, and then post a private backstage argument publicly for millions of fans to see felt, to Ziggler, like a final insult layered on top of everything else. It was not really about one single match at all. It was about years of feeling like the full-time roster carried the weight, while a handful of protected legends took the credit and the spotlight. Ziggler had been used before to help build up other returning stars, absorbing hard falls and giving them their moment. And by 2019, that pattern was starting to wear thin for him. Watching the aftermath of that match spread across social media, with fans mostly praising Goldberg's power rather than Ziggler's effort, only made the frustration harder to swallow quietly. Wrestlers who had worked alongside Ziggler for years understood exactly why he reacted the way he did, even if they never said so publicly, because the same pattern had played out with other returning legends long before Goldberg ever arrived. Number 9 is Roman Reigns. This clash did not begin inside a wrestling ring at all, oddly enough. It began with a simple question about a piece of tape wrapped around a wrestler's arm. Roman Reigns wore a small protective pad on his arm to stop himself breaking his hand every time he punched the steel entrance ramp before his matches. A fan asked him about it online, and Reigns explained honestly that he could not afford to injure himself doing something pointless when he was expected to perform almost every single week of the year without a real break. Then he added a line aimed directly at Goldberg, comparing that kind of pointless ritual to headbutting a door before a match, and calling the whole idea stupid. That comment landed as a direct hit on one of Goldberg's oldest and most personal rituals. For years, he had headbutted steel locker room doors before walking out to the ring, often leaving himself bleeding and dazed before the bell had even rung. He believed the pain and the blood made his character feel more real to the people watching at home. When he heard what Reigns had said about it, he did not let the comment slide quietly. He called Reigns a joke in a public interview, and defended the headbutting as one of the things that had helped build the very kind of larger-than-life character that wrestlers like Reigns now got to enjoy without paying the same physical price. It became a clear clash between two very different philosophies. One man believed in short, hyper-intense, physically reckless realism to protect his aura. The other believed in discipline, safety, and physical longevity across a demanding weekly schedule. They eventually wrestled each other properly at a major event, and Reigns won clean in front of a packed arena. By that point in his career, Goldberg looked less like the future of the business and more like a warning from its past. Their planned match at a huge stadium show had actually fallen apart earlier, when health concerns during a global pandemic forced the company to cancel it, meaning the argument between them sat unfinished in the public eye for far longer than either man expected. That delay only added fuel to the online debate, with fans picking sides between the old-school ideal of pain as proof and the modern reality of a schedule that simply does not allow for unnecessary risk. Reigns represented a business built around weekly television and constant appearances. Goldberg represented a business built around rare, protected moments designed to feel special precisely because they did not happen very often. The two approaches were never going to sit comfortably side by side. Fans picked up on this divide quickly, splitting into camps almost overnight, with older viewers defending Goldberg's willingness to bleed for his character and younger viewers siding firmly with Reigns and his focus on long-term health. That online argument outlived the actual match itself by a wide margin. Number 8 is Vince Russo. Russo ran WCW's creative direction during one of the strangest and most chaotic periods the promotion ever went through, a time built on shock value, sudden twists, and storylines that often made very little sense from one week to the next for viewers trying to follow along at home. He never seemed to fully understand how to book a character like Goldberg properly, a man whose entire appeal was built on looking completely unbeatable. That mismatch between Russo's chaotic style and Goldberg's fragile aura nearly cost Goldberg the use of his own arm. In one particular segment, Goldberg was directed to chase a limousine into a parking lot and smash out its windows on live television. To keep things safe, he was given black tape for his hands and a small metal pipe hidden inside his fist to help break the glass without injury. But during the very first strikes, the pipe flew out of his grip and landed inside the vehicle. Rather than stopping the segment, an adrenaline-filled Goldberg carried on smashing the remaining real glass windows, using his bare forearm instead. The glass sliced open a major artery in his arm. He began bleeding heavily on live television and was rushed straight to hospital for emergency surgery. He needed 40 stitches to close the wound, was sidelined from wrestling for 5 full months, and was later told by medical staff that the injury had come within centimeters of costing him the use of his arm completely. Then came another disaster only months later. During a triple threat match, Russo booked a confusing worked shoot angle where Goldberg was made to look like he had suddenly gone off script and walked out on the match halfway through, refusing to cooperate with his opponents. The very next night, Russo cut a shoot-style promo demanding that Goldberg be fired from the company entirely, presenting the entire mess as if it were completely real rather than scripted. Fans were left genuinely confused about what was real and what was not, and Goldberg's carefully built aura took another serious hit. He never forgave Russo for either moment. He believed Russo's chaotic, high-pressure style had nearly cost him his arm, and had done lasting damage to the character he had worked so hard to build from nothing. These two disasters landed within less than a year of each other, and together they painted a picture of a creative team that simply did not understand how fragile Goldberg's whole appeal really was. His entire character depended on looking calm, controlled, and completely dominant at all times. Russo's chaotic style demanded constant chaos, confusion, and unpredictability, the exact opposite of everything Goldberg's monster persona needed to stay believable. The limousine injury in particular left a permanent physical reminder on his arm, a scar he still carries today from a segment that should never have put him in real danger in the first place. Colleagues backstage later admitted that watching Goldberg bleed so heavily that night was frightening even for hardened veterans used to seeing real blood in the ring, and it left a lasting impression on exactly how far Russo's chaotic ideas could push a performer without proper safety checks in place. Number 7 is Scott Hall. Scott Hall was one of the most respected and experienced hands working backstage at that time, a man who genuinely cared about making his opponents look good, while also keeping them physically safe throughout every match he took part in. He and Goldberg clashed largely because Goldberg simply did not yet understand the unwritten rules that veterans like Hall lived by. During one televised match, Hall threw a completely normal, stiff chest chop, the exact kind of strike wrestlers trade constantly without any issue. Goldberg, who had never properly learned how to take a hit and simply let it go, answered back with a dangerously hard Irish whip, dragging Hall violently into the ropes, with far more force than the moment ever called for. The rest of the locker room noticed immediately. Veteran performers viewed the response as reckless and unprofessional, especially inside WCW's smaller-sized rings, which left far less room to control momentum and avoid serious injury during a fast-paced sequence. The tension carried straight into their next major televised match, where Goldberg barely sold any of Hall's offense at all, in front of a red-hot crowd, which only frustrated the veterans around him even further. Their feud was eventually settled on screen through a rough and physical stun gun ladder match that closed the story out completely. Off-screen, it took years, but the two men eventually built real respect for one another before Hall sadly passed away, with Goldberg later crediting Hall publicly for helping build his early drawing power, even after everything that had happened between them in those earlier years. Hall had been through the territory system properly, learning his craft the slow, traditional way over many years before he ever became a star. That difference in background sat underneath almost every disagreement the two men ever had. Hall saw wrestling as a shared craft, built on trust between two performers working together to create something believable. Goldberg, still new to the business and used to matches that barely lasted a minute, had not yet learned to see it that way at all. It took real time, several rough matches, and a great deal of patience from Hall before the two of them ever found common ground. Hall was known throughout the locker room for quietly mentoring younger talent, walking them through timing and cooperation step by step, rather than simply letting them figure it out through painful trial and error. And even Goldberg eventually admitted that those lessons had shaped him more than he had been willing to accept at the time. Number 6 is Kevin Nash. Nash is tied to the single biggest turning point of Goldberg's early career, the night his famous unbeaten run finally came to an end, after what had felt like an unstoppable, historic stretch of victories. Goldberg had won match after match without a single loss, building a winning streak that made him feel completely untouchable to fans watching every week. At a major pay-per-view in December 1998, that streak came crashing down in total chaos. Several other wrestlers interfered directly in the finish, and a man disguised as ringside security shocked Goldberg with a fake, high-voltage cattle prod. Nash then hit his finishing powerbomb and secured the pinfall victory, ending the streak and winning the championship in the same moment. The crowd genuinely popped for the shocking finish in the moment, but the story that followed fell apart almost immediately. The very next night, the entire angle was completely undercut by a silly, throwaway finish where the title changed hands again, through nothing more than a single playful touch, instantly burying any real chance of a proper rematch or a serious chase for revenge. Goldberg was furious about how it had all been handled. He felt that the single biggest weapon he had, his perfect unbeaten record, had been thrown away for a cheap laugh, rather than protected for a bigger future payoff. For a long time afterwards, he blamed Nash directly, believing Nash had used his backstage influence on the booking committee to make it happen deliberately. Nash always pushed back firmly against that accusation, pointing out that he did not officially hold any real creative power at the company until months after that particular event had already taken place. Eventually, the two men reached a genuine peace, built slowly over years spent surviving the very same political battles backstage together. But Goldberg never fully got back what that single chaotic night had taken away from his character. The frustrating part, from Goldberg's point of view, was how avoidable the whole thing felt. He had spent well over a year building a genuinely historic winning streak that fans everywhere had bought into completely. Ending that streak was always going to happen eventually, but ending it through outside interference and a fake weapon, only to have the entire result mocked and reversed the very next night, made the whole sacrifice feel pointless. Wrestling historians still debate today whether a cleaner, simpler finish might have protected Goldberg's aura far better while still giving Nash the win he needed. A decision that in hindsight looks like one of the clearest booking mistakes of that entire era. Nash, for his part, always maintained that he was simply doing the job he was booked to do that night, and that the decision to undercut the moment so quickly came from above him, not from anything he personally controlled. Fans at the time did not know any of this backstage context, and simply watched the story unfold on television as one confusing moment after another, which only added to Goldberg's sense that the whole situation had spiraled completely out of his control. Number 5 is Triple H. This is one of the longest-running clashes on the entire list, and it actually started well before Goldberg ever set foot inside a WWE ring for the very first time as a contracted performer. The two men first came face-to-face at a public autograph signing event, where Goldberg confronted Triple H directly over comments he had made in interviews, questioning his in-ring ability. Triple H stayed completely calm and simply brushed the confrontation off with a smirk, which only made Goldberg angrier in the moment. He stormed away from the signing in front of watching staff and fans, looking visibly unprofessional in the process. Years later, once Goldberg had finally signed with WWE, the underlying tension only grew worse over time. He felt he was deliberately being booked in a way that slowly chipped away at the aura he had spent years building, pushed into longer competitive matches, and comedic segments that did not suit his style at all. That frustration boiled over during a major pay-per-view match, when an injured Triple H still found a way to pin him cleanly, using a sledgehammer shot, even with the entire crowd firmly behind Goldberg that night. After another defeat to Triple H not long afterwards, Goldberg reportedly lost his temper completely in the locker room, throwing items and shouting loudly before Triple H came in personally to confront him about it. The two men parted ways not long after that, with genuine, lasting dislike between them. It took well over a decade, and a very different Triple H working in a business role rather than as an active wrestler, before the two of them could finally build something professional and mutually valuable together. Part of what made this feud so personal was the position Triple H held at the company beyond the ring itself. He was married into the family that ran the business, which meant Goldberg often felt he was fighting a battle he could never fully win, no matter how loud the crowd cheered for him on any given night. Every decision that seemed to favor Triple H felt, to Goldberg, like proof that the deck was stacked against him from the very start. That sense of an unfair fight sat underneath the anger for years, long after the shouting in the locker room had died down. Even the way their rivalry eventually cooled down said something about the business itself. It was only once Triple H moved away from active competition and into a role focused on the future of the company that a genuine, working relationship with Goldberg became possible, built on shared business interests rather than any real personal warmth between the two of them. Number 4 is William Regal. If you want to see the real gap between Goldberg's carefully protected push and his actual in-ring ability at the time, this is the match people still point to decades later. Goldberg was deep into his unbeaten run, used entirely to short matches that barely lasted a minute against overmatched opponents. Regal was a serious technical wrestler with a genuine background in real shoot fighting and catch wrestling, and he returned from a lengthy suspension fully ready to test Goldberg properly for the very first time in front of a national television audience. The commentary team even built the matchup beforehand as the single hardest test of Goldberg's young career to that point. Once the bell rang, Regal completely refused to play along with the usual short, easy formula everyone expected. He worked stiff throughout, snapping in hard uppercuts and applying tight, realistic holds that Goldberg simply was not used to countering. Goldberg looked completely lost in the ring. He could not properly read Regal's physical cues, could not find his usual comfortable rhythm, and for the first time on national television, he looked genuinely mortal in front of millions of fans. Regal later explained that he had simply been instructed to give Goldberg a proper 6-minute competitive contest that still ended with Goldberg winning at the finish, and that Goldberg himself had refused to take the openings he was repeatedly given during the match. Goldberg saw the entire situation very differently, believing for years afterwards that Regal had taken cheap physical shots at him purely out of professional jealousy. He said publicly, years later, that he would still welcome a real fight with Regal to properly settle the score between them. Regal was let go from the company not long after that particular match aired, and the bitterness between the two men has never fully healed to this day. Management's anger at Regal said a great deal about how the entire business around Goldberg actually worked behind the scenes. He was not simply a wrestler being pushed to the top. He was a protected investment, carefully shielded from anything that might expose the gaps in his experience. Regal, whether by instruction or by his own choice, pulled that curtain back for 6 long minutes on live television, and the punishment for doing so fell entirely on him rather than on the system that had left Goldberg so unprepared for a real technical contest in the first place. Years later, wrestling fans revisiting the footage online would often point to that single match as genuine proof of exactly how far Goldberg still had to go as a technical performer, regardless of how dominant he looked in his usual heavily protected squash matches. Number 3 is Chris Jericho. This clash began as a creative idea and ended as a genuine physical fight backstage. While both men were still working together in WCW, Jericho built an entire storyline around chasing a match with Goldberg, using comedy and constant claims of secret hidden victories to build genuine interest from the audience. It was designed to lead toward one big pay-per-view match where Goldberg would finally spear him down in front of a packed house, elevating both performers in the process. Goldberg flatly refused to take part in any of it. He believed his serious monster character had no business anywhere near comedy segments of that kind, and that working closely with a smaller, lighter wrestler like Jericho would seriously damage the main event aura he had carefully built over time. Jericho felt completely shut down and personally disrespected by the refusal. Years later, once both men were working together in WWE, that underlying tension finally exploded into something real. Jericho heard through the grapevine that Goldberg had been bad-mouthing him and other former WCW performers behind his back to other wrestlers in the dressing room. He confronted Goldberg directly backstage and warned him plainly that this kind of political behavior would not be tolerated inside WWE's locker room. Goldberg responded physically, grabbing Jericho by the throat in front of everyone nearby. Jericho, drawing on real grappling skills he had picked up from watching genuine shoot fighting, swept Goldberg's hand away, avoided a double-leg takedown attempt, and locked the much bigger man in a tight front facelock, wrapping his legs around Goldberg's body to control him completely until other wrestlers rushed in to pull them apart in the hallway. It was a genuine shock to everyone who witnessed it, watching a smaller, quicker wrestler hold his own so effectively against wrestling's biggest monster of the era. The two men eventually shook hands and agreed to move forward professionally, and years later they built real, lasting mutual respect for one another, even joking openly about the old fight on Jericho's own media platform. But the moment itself proved something that stuck with people backstage for a very long time afterwards. For Jericho, the fight was never really about winning a physical confrontation. It was about proving a point to an entire locker room that had watched a bigger, more protected star talk down about smaller performers without consequence for years. Holding his own against Goldberg, even briefly, changed how people in the back looked at him from that day forward. For Goldberg, the experience was a rare moment where his size and power simply did not matter. And that kind of lesson tends to stay with a person for a very long time, whether they admit it publicly or not. Once the two men eventually became friendly, they discussed the fight openly in public, both agreeing that it had come from a place of youthful pride, rather than any deep personal hatred, which made their later friendship feel genuine, rather than simply a convenient business arrangement. Number 2 is Matt Riddle. This clash belongs firmly to a newer generation of wrestlers, and it says a great deal about how differently modern performers view safety, respect, and reputation. Riddle, a legitimate former mixed martial arts competitor with real combat sports credentials earned outside of wrestling entirely, used interviews and social media constantly to publicly question Goldberg's safety record and technical wrestling ability. His comments grew noticeably sharper after Goldberg had a rough, genuinely dangerous match against The Undertaker, in which he knocked himself out and very nearly hurt both men involved in front of a huge live crowd. Riddle called him unsafe and a poor technical wrestler in public, and he did not hold back at all in how he phrased it. The tension eventually boiled over into a real backstage confrontation at a major event, caught entirely on camera by the production crew working that night. Goldberg confronted Riddle directly in a hallway and told him bluntly that he was not his bro, criticizing him sharply for what he saw as a total lack of professional respect toward a veteran. He pointed out just how much bigger his own bank account was compared to Riddle's at that point in their careers, and Riddle simply shrugged the comment off, calmly replying that he was sure it was huge indeed. Goldberg later compared Riddle in interviews to something stuck in his nose that simply would not go away no matter what he did. Riddle later admitted publicly that a lot of his earlier trash talk had actually been a deliberate attempt to build genuine interest in a future money match between them, much the same way real combat sports athletes promote an upcoming fight to sell tickets. In the end, the two of them found real peace together during a long charter flight to an overseas event, quietly settling their differences and moving forward as working professionals from that point on. What made this clash stand out from the others on this list was how public the entire thing was allowed to become. In earlier decades, this kind of disagreement would have stayed strictly backstage, discussed quietly among wrestlers and rarely reaching fans directly. Riddle's generation grew up online, comfortable airing disagreements in public for the world to see and react to in real time. Goldberg, shaped by an older, more private locker room culture, found that shift genuinely difficult to deal with, and his frustration in that hallway confrontation reflected a much wider gap between two very different eras of the same business. Riddle's combat sports background also meant he genuinely did not fear a physical confrontation with a much bigger man, something that set him apart from many performers who might have backed down quietly rather than push a veteran star that far in a real hallway argument. And now, the man who started this whole story from the very first line. Number 1 on this list is Bret Hart. Nothing else on this list truly compares to what happened between Bill Goldberg and Bret Hart. Bret was one of the most respected technical wrestlers of his entire generation, a man famous for delivering hard-hitting, believable matches without ever actually hurting the person standing across the ring from him. In December 1999, the two men met in a match for the World Heavyweight Championship. During the contest, Goldberg threw a stiff thrust kick toward Bret's head as he rebounded off the ropes at speed. The kick landed with far too much raw force behind it. Bret suffered a severe concussion in that instant, and the effects did not stop there at all. He developed lasting post-concussion syndrome that lingered for years afterwards, and it eventually played a direct part in a stroke he suffered years later, one that permanently ended any hope of him ever wrestling again in a competitive ring. For a wrestler whose entire career had been built on precision, control, and protecting the men he worked with, losing his own health to a single careless strike from another performer felt like a particularly cruel way for his in-ring story to end. What makes this entire story even worse is exactly what happened next. Instead of protecting an injured man, the company kept booking Bret in extremely physical matches in the days right after his concussion, including one brutal hardcore match that involved repeated strikes to the head with a garbage can lid. Bret also suffered a separate, serious accident on a vehicle years later during his retirement, one that added significantly to his long-term neurological health problems. Even with all of that context, Bret placed the overwhelming blame for the sudden end of his in-ring career squarely on Goldberg alone. He said publicly, on more than one occasion, that the injury had cost him a contract worth £16 million that he never got the chance to properly earn. For years afterwards, Bret used almost every single interview opportunity he could find to criticize Goldberg's technical skill, his safety awareness, and his general professional intelligence, going as far as saying openly that Goldberg did not even deserve to be honored by the wrestling industry at all, and comparing him unfavorably, in blunt terms, to wrestlers who worked far lower on the card throughout their entire careers, without ever headlining a single major show. Goldberg apologized. He apologized many times over the years, in public interviews and in private conversations, and said repeatedly that he would carry the guilt of that single night with him for the rest of his life. But apologies can only carry a person so far when the other side keeps bringing the same pain back into the public spotlight again and again. Eventually, Goldberg had simply had enough. He said plainly, in more than one interview, that he was completely done apologizing, that he had already said sorry more times than he could possibly count, and that he was not going to keep tearing himself down over a genuine accident that happened when he was young, green, and still learning the business properly. He dismissed Bret's continued public complaints as nothing more than endless moaning that would never truly end, no matter what he said or did to try and make things right between them. Speaking on wrestling podcasts, Goldberg made clear that he had reached a genuine breaking point, one built on years of watching the same story replayed publicly with little acknowledgement of the sincere remorse he had already shown, both privately and on camera, in the years right after the injury first happened. Some fans see only the entrance, the spear and the roar of the crowd echoing around the arena, and to them Goldberg will always be one of the greatest attractions the business ever produced. Others look past the entrance and remember the men left bruised, concussed, or genuinely bitter along the way, and to them his legacy will always carry a lasting asterisk that no amount of nostalgia can fully erase. Perhaps the truest way to understand Bill Goldberg is to hold both pictures at once, the roaring crowd and the quiet locker room resentment, side by side, because neither one on its own tells the whole story of the man wrestling fans watched rise so fast, and never quite forgot, right through to this very day.